people who have 5 o'clock shadow at 8 in the morning, and gentlemen, welcome to the lowlifecool refutation station. After exiting his channel, please make sure you wash your hands. I had a very short-lived debate with one of Hot Dog Fail's little buddies, lowlifecool. Lowlife got extremely upset after a week or so and blocked me to prevent him from being embarrassed any further. However, I did save screenshots of all the messages he left on my channel, and a few on his channel that were responses to me. If you've ever had the pleasure of discussing anything with this mental midget, you already know that he violates Godwin's law on a regular basis. Perhaps he doesn't know that the first person to accuse the other of being a Nazi loses. Lowlife conceded numerous times. This person also uses several tactics to get his opponent off balance and to get off the subject. At one point, this clown was acting as if I was hitting on him. And even brought up the subject of pornography right out of the blue. Don't allow this tiny man to detour the debate with his nonsense. Keep on topic, and eventually he'll be forced to block you. I don't find his tactics surprising, though. His friend Hot Dog Fail incessantly talks about penises. It must run in the family. Quite odd, to say the least. Another diversion this little man tried was insisting that he wouldn't check the portion of my website where I debunked his friend Hot Dog Fail, claiming that I was using myself as a source. Quite odd as well. I always link to my material, unlike lowlifecool, who rarely references his material. At one point, I even put several links in the top left-hand corner of my channel so he could check it. He refused to check it, and shortly after that, I was blocked. Spoon-feeding him didn't even work. All the relevant screenshots are scrolling by, including the one where I left the comment for lowlifecool on my channel. 3 links up in the corner. Let's get down to brass tacks. There's more at the link under the video, as always. Check that out. Because of time constraints, I can't cover everything. I asked Mr. Lowlifecool about Hot Dog Fail's statement that roads and bridges were underfunded and ignored before Hussein Obama became president. Lowlifecool just ignored the links I gave him and insisted that I had not supplied him with ample evidence. I even spoon-fed it to him. That wasn't good enough. Inflation from fiscal year 1990 through the end of fiscal year 2009 was 73.92%. The Department of Transportation has increased its outlays in the following manner: from $25.642 billion nominal dollars in 1990 to $73.004 billion in 2009. If that funding had been increased by the rate of inflation in fiscal year 2009, it would have been under $45 billion. Federal government doled out $19.174 billion in transportation grants to state and local entities in fiscal year 1990. Again, this is nominal dollars. That grew to $55.438 billion in 2009. If that funding had increased at the rate of inflation, it would have been under $35 billion. Both those figures, again, well above the rate of inflation. The federal government increased, again in constant dollars, grants to states from $198.1 billion in 1990 to $482.9 billion in 2009. The increase was almost 2.5 times greater than the rate of inflation. This includes grants for transportation and other items. Where is this money going? There's obviously plenty of it. Lowlifecool doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. In addition, my point that a much smaller number of bridges were structurally deficient in 2008 than in 1990 stands. I accept your concession, little man. The next tack this tool will attempt is to partially concede my point and then whine that we still need more money. Where have I heard this before? When a government venture fails, leftists pull out the we need even more money, a few trillion more, and we'll have a veritable utopia. The money is there, it's being wasted. I went through the budget myself and I can find over $200 billion every year. Keep in mind, lowlifecool also believes that if a bridge in Jerkwater, Montana needs work, no offense to my friends in Montana, then it's the job of the federal government to come there, change everyone's diaper, hold their hand and say, "We're going to fix that bridge for you, okay?" The federal government is charged to establish post roads, and it went and did that even with the interstate highway system under Eisenhower. However, I don't see why the feds have to be the state's 24/7 caretaker. So let's say I grant the tool's point that we need even more money for transportation. I'm going to get my clippers out and I'm going to give the federal budget a haircut. As I pointed out in my videos on public transportation, the costs of operating it have increased well above the rate of inflation since the government took it over in 1965. It's inefficient and largely a money hole since the government took it over. We also spend about $40 billion on it every year. About 40% of all fuel taxes from people driving cars goes to public transportation, museums, nature trails, etc. There's $40 billion in funding right there. We can shut down the Federal Department of Education. There's another winner. Education is left to the states under the 10th Amendment. Shutting that down would have saved us $53 billion in fiscal year 2009. That's $93 billion so far. If we defund, quote, international development and humanitarian assistance, end quote, that would save us another $22 billion. Add in the dissolution of the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. That saves us another $61 billion. This includes about $10 billion in funds for community development and area and regional development, funds to revitalize various main streets across the fruited plain. A waste of money and not transportation. I just saved $176 billion in one single fiscal year. Don't tell me the money isn't available, low life. Here's another point to consider. A lot of highway funds are earmarked or wasted, never spent. There's about $13 billion in orphan earmarks out there, funds for transportation projects that never got spent because of a clerical error in the legislation or some other BS. I can find some more. Cut off, quote, commerce and housing credit, unquote, end quote, portion of the Department of Energy, and that saves us $7.8 billion. I can guarantee, etch it in stone, that there's more than $10 billion in wasted earmarks for ridiculous projects, even more than that actually, probably about 20. See my 2 video responses to the now defunct FKASG9 SSM channel for examples. I saved over $200 billion in 1 year. There's $2 trillion over the next 10 years, fish face. Don't tell me the money isn't there. Now let's switch gears to Low Life Tool's contention that Kennedy's tax cuts were Keynesian. That made me laugh. A person making $400,000 and 1 cent in 1961 was taxed at 91% from that point on. In 1964 it was 77%, and in 1965 it was 70% after 200,000. In addition, the bottom rate was cut from 20 to 14%. How is that Keynesian? I don't think he even really understands Keynesian economics. Granted, those tax rates were still stratospheric, but a gargantuan reduction from years past. Kennedy posthumously cut taxes across the board. Then I pointed out to this little man that raising taxes isn't going to get you a much larger chunk of revenue as a percentage of GDP. Personal income taxes were cut in 1964. Average tax revenue as a percentage of GDP for the previous 10 years equals 17.47%. The following 10, it was 17.98%. GDP was $377 billion in 1954 and $599.2 billion in 1963, and it grew from $687.5 billion in 1965 to $1.438 trillion in 1974. It more than doubled after the Kennedy tax cuts. Average tax revenue as a percentage of GDP from 1994 to 2000 was 19.24%. The average from 1992 to 2000 was 18.75%. One must also consider Clinton and his GOP Congress cut the capital gains rate from 28 to 20% in 1997, and the income tax rates under Clinton were still much lower than they were in the 60s and 70s. Federal tax revenue as a percentage of GDP from 1970 to 82, 18.2%. GDP increased from $1.012 trillion in 1970 to $3.223 trillion in 1982. After inflation was brought under control, of course, I believe the Federal Reserve exacerbated our economic problems during the 70s, just as they are now. after inflation was brought under control and the Reagan personal and corporate income tax reductions took full effect in 1983. Federal tax revenue as a percentage of GDP from 1983 to 1995 equals 17.86%. GDP grew from $3.44 trillion in 1983 to $7.341 trillion in 1995. Keep in mind, top personal and corporate tax rates fell substantially the period 1983 to 2000, with lower tax rates in the 1970 to 82 period. Federal tax revenue as a percentage of GDP 83 to 2000 was 18.36%. One must also remember that poor economies always grow faster. It's hard to keep up that amazing growth forever. Lowlife Tool then countered with Kennedy crackdown on loopholes. I'll come out again and say I'd rather see the income tax eliminated and only consumption taxed, or we can go to a two-tier income tax system with brackets of 10 and 20%, 20% for a single filer after they hit $50,000, and zero deductions. I'll also point out that from 1941 to 1962, the Democrats controlled both chambers of Congress for 14 years. The Republicans only 2. The rest of the time it was either a deadlock or party control flipped back and forth in between elections due to resignations and whatnot. My point is, if there are loopholes in there, there's a good chance it was inserted by a Democrat Congress because Congress writes the tax code. Hello, McFly? Anyone home? Lowlife Tool also attempted to use Bill Clinton to strengthen his case, forgetting, and I mentioned this earlier, forgetting that personal income tax rates of his era were still much lower than the 70s and previous decades. He also doesn't know that George W. Bush's spending increases, excluding payments on the debt, and after factoring in inflation, were almost 3 times larger than Bill Clinton's. Clinton also signed NAFTA, welfare reform, temporary assistance for needy families, which should have been done to every means-tested welfare program, and signed legislation cutting the capital gains rate right at the height of the tech boom. Using Slick Willie Clinton is going to help your case, Tool. Lowlife Tool also attempted to credit the economic turnaround under Reagan to hiking Social Security payroll taxes. Question: those taxes were raised 5 times in the 1970s. What happened there? Again, Lowlife Tool never focuses on monetary policy. It's as if the Federal Reserve doesn't exist in his mind. No, Lowlife, the economy began crawling out the Carter recession in 83 after the tax cuts, and about the time inflation got under control. Inflation was 61.2% from 1977 to 1981 and through 1981. It was only 30.27% from 1983 to 1989. Funny how the Tool never considers that. Last item, Volcker had to choke off the money supply to get inflation under control. We were better off in the long run. Last item, the Tool attempted in a very generalized fashion to paint everyone who doesn't believe in anthropogenic global warming as funded by big oil. He just brought this up out of the blue. See my Guns and Greenhouse Gases Part 2 video. I've already had a clown try that. In addition, officials of a dozen top big green environmental groups contributed more than $14.5 million to congressional and presidential candidates in 2008 and through the second quarter of 2010, with 96% of the total going to Democrats, according to an Examiner analysis of federal campaign data. The groups included the Audubon Society, Clean Water Action, Defenders of Wildlife, etc., Ocean Champions, Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy, National Resources Defense Council, etc. 6 of the dozen collectively received more than $160 million in federal grants and contracts according to their 2008 or 2007 IRS tax returns, with the Nature Conservancy's $110.6 million being the highest, followed by the Trust for Public Land, $28 million, Audubon Society, $17.5 million, Environmental Defense Fund, $3.6 million, National Resources Defense Council, $358,000, etc. Employees of those 6 receiving federal dollars gave nearly $6.6 million to Democrat candidates in the 2008-2010 period. Covered $6.6 million to Democrats, $313,348 to Republicans. 2 of the 6 have political action committees. Nice one. Have a nice day. Oh, and Lowlife Tool, if you have a problem with me, what are you going to do about it? Put up a video response, maybe put up a blog, use up some of that free time of yours, I don't know. Bring it. Just don't tell your stepdaddy on me. Please, don't tell your stepdaddy. Don't go whine to stepdaddy about it. I think I have seen you somewhere before, though.